Greyhaven already resembles a widow. You may as well keep each other. Everett Harrow did not stand to say it. He slid the iron key across the solicitor's polished table. Through a ring of water his own glass had left, and let it come to rest against the edge of the deed. He handed off the heaviest burden in his father's estate with the same easy hand he used to keep its richest ground. Ambrose Harrow had been dead 4 days. His coffin waited in the next room while his 3 heirs sat in the parlor and heard the will. Everett took Willow Bend, 1,100 acres, the cattle, the upper spring, the barns, the family brand. Nathaniel took the wheat bottom, the mill shares, the granary, the teams. Lenora, the widow of the dead man's dead son, took the cold stone manor on Storm-Glass Bluff, 94 eroding acres, a slope of neglected vines, and the mortgage that came stitched to all of it. The spring pipe that had watered the bluff for 20 years crossed Everett's new ground, so he struck it from her deed. He struck the wagon road with it. She had a cistern, he told her. She had more rooms than one woman could freeze inside. Lenora said nothing. Before the solicitor drew the map away, she set one finger on a faint circle Ambrose had penciled around the library and the high bluff, and thought of dry air moving through a boarded room. The room was small and hot with too many people in it. Hollis Baird, the solicitor, read the terms in a voice that never rose. Merritt Coe, the merchant who held the paper, sat forward with his elbows on his knees and watched the widow's face while the debt found its owner. $1,180 at 8%. $300 due after the first harvest. The balance the following September. Default gave up the manor, the cellar, the tools, the mare, the silver. All of it named on the schedule Coe had brought and would not let out of his hand. Lenora read every line before she signed. She did not skim it, and she did not weep over it. She smoothed the page flat with the side of her palm, and if the palm trembled, she pressed it down until it stopped, and she signed her name in a hand that came out steady. She asked for nothing better. That was the thing the 3 men in the room would remember later, each in his own way, that she was handed the worst of it, and did not open her mouth to complain. Inez Renteria sat behind her with the deed already folded in her lap. She had kept Greyhaven's cellar 19 years and buried a mason husband along the way, and she folded that single sheet tighter and tighter through the reading until one corner opened the skin of her palm. A dark bead rose there. She did not look at it. She looked at Everett, who rubbed his thumb along the brim of his hat and looked at the window. Nathaniel Harrow, the middle brother, studied the floor between his boots and said not one word in his sister-in-law's defense. Weeks before, he had proposed a cottage for her and a small pension. He had not pressed it when Everett drew the lines. He let them stand, and he lowered his head when they were read aloud, and the lowering of it was the only argument he made. When the map came off the table, Lenora took the iron key, the mortgage notice, and Ambrose's marked chart, and carried all 3 out into the April cold. Behind her, Coe was already asking Baird when the first installment cleared. Greyhaven stood 2 miles up the bluff road, Everett's road now, and they reached it by the county track instead, which added an hour and a broken creek crossing to every trip they would ever make. The manor rose gray out of gray stone, 31 rooms under a roof that had shed slates for 6 winters. Water stains ran down the north face. Half the windows were boarded. Below the house, the vineyard had gone to black cordwood on rusted wire. Amos Drennan, a cattle buyer who tested every fence rail he passed with the toe of his boot, had a name for the place before they had spent a night in it. He got it at Coe's store, where such names were made. The Stone Tomb. By week's end, half the basin used it. Inez walked the ground floor with a lamp and a ledger and counted what they had. because that was how she began every hard thing, by knowing the true size of it. 3 sacks of flour, 1 sack of beans, bedding, a cook stove, 2 trunks, Ezra Vale's old tool chest with the best of its tools already gone, Penny, the little bay mare who had pulled them up the track, and Rook, the black and white dog, who trotted the length of the cold hall and went straight to the west end of the library and lay down against the base of the wall as though a hand had set him there. They closed 26 rooms and kept 5 and the kitchen. There was no arguing the manor warm. Inez measured the cistern with a knotted string and found 14 feet of stone holding 4 feet of water, the rest lost through a cracked mouth and a gutter packed with 6 winters of leaves. She wrote the 4 feet down. She wrote the flour and the beans down beside it, and the days they would carry 2 women and a horse and a dog, and the number was short. That night she drew 4 columns on a clean page and headed them mortgage, seed, feed, repairs, and left them empty because there was nothing yet to put in them. "How long," Inez said, "before this hill feeds us?" "I don't know," Lenora said. She did not soften it. Inez wrote that down too, in her own fashion, and blew out the lamp. Lenora went to the library wall in the morning, because she had come to Greyhaven already knowing there was something behind it. She had felt it months earlier, on a visit to Ambrose's sickbed she had not wanted to make. A current of dry air crossing the boarded room, steady as breath, where every window was shut. Wet stone does not make dry air. Something behind the masonry moved it, and moving air comes from somewhere and goes somewhere, and both ends had been hidden by a careful hand. The mahogany shelving ran floor to ceiling along the west end, screwed black with age to the stone. Lenora set the bar under the case's foot and felt the whole unit shift too easily. On hinges someone had oiled and painted over. Behind it, a false backing of thin cedar. Behind the cedar, cut into the wall, a barred iron door. She held a thread of wool to the gap, and it pulled flat and stayed there, trembling, drawn toward the crack. The door opened inward, against the weight of the hill. A man had framed it to carry that weight so it would never bind, and Lenora remembered a thing Daniel had told her once, and she had taken for a joke, that his grandfather had built Greyhaven backward, starting underground and finishing with the rooms. It had not been a joke. It had been a survey note, and she had been too young a wife to hear it. Inside the first passage sat a cedar box. In it, a narrow stone hammer, a set of iron dividers, a coil of mason's string gone stiff, a worn pencil, 2 copper leveling plates, and a plumb bob mended with fishing line, and a notebook with most of its pages torn clean out, 1 line surviving on the last. The water that hurts a wall began somewhere higher. She knew the hand before she knew the words. It was her father's. Ezra Vale had dressed quarry stone his whole life and taught her to read a stone's bed before she could read a book, and these were his tools, carried here and hidden here by someone who understood what they were. Daniel, she thought. Daniel had done the dangerous work on this land and told her half of it and gone off a logging road before he could tell the rest. The line brought the rain back to her. She had been 17 and proud, a patch of cracked wall waiting in the quarry, and she had wanted to fix it the moment the weather broke. Ezra made her stand in the rain instead, an hour of it, soaked through and furious, while he pointed not at the crack where the stones had finally given, but at a place higher on the face where the water first came weeping through. There, he had said, when it showed. That is the wound. The rest is only where it screamed. 6 weeks later, the capstone he was resetting slipped and took the strength of her left wrist with it. Cold weather still found the joint. She lifted heavy stone with a bar now and let the bar be strong where she was not, and did not pretend otherwise. Her father had given her the reading of water. Tomas Renteria had given her the rest. He was Inez's husband, dead now, a mason born in Sonora who had built vineyard terraces and ranch walls and spring channels the length of the valley, and he had told her the thing that governed all of it, plainly, more than once. Give water a door before it makes one. She had not understood it at 17. She understood it now, with her father's notebook in her hand and a hill full of water above her head. The passage went down. A stone stair wound around an open shaft, and cool air rose against her face, drawn in through some hidden mouth on the uphill side, carried the length of the house, and let out at last behind the very shelf she had moved. The manor everyone called damp had been given lungs. It breathed, and the breathing kept the deep stone dry, and no one living had known it, because the man who built it told no one, and the man who inherited it left it sealed. At the bottom lay the cellar chamber. Inez came down with the lamp and stood a long moment without speaking, because her husband's hand was in this room. Tomas's stone templates leaned where he had left them. Beside them stood 18 wine barrels, and Inez went along the row and rapped each head with a knuckle and listened. 11 rang full and sound. 7 answered dull and soured, and she chalked those without being asked. There was more, and none of it was the thing the story would turn on, whatever it looked like in lamplight. Bundles of survey stakes, spare drain tile still sound, a locked plan chest with no key in sight, 3 silver serving pieces in oiled cloth, and in a tin box, $670 in gold certificates, bearer paper, legitimate, the kind the Treasury had been shipping west for years, spendable at any bank that would count it. Lenora held the tin and felt the shape of the temptation in it, and did not mistake it for rescue. $670 against $1,180 of debt. The roof alone would eat half the tin and leave the seed unbought and the winter unfed. Money enough to make a hard choice, not money enough to make the choice go away. That evening, Inez filled her 4 columns. She set the tin's figure beside them and drew a line under all of it. It fills 3, she said. It will not fill 4. Choose 3. The roof waits for the wall, Lenora said. The wall can't wait for the roof. Inez studied her a moment. Then she counted $180 onto the table and set the rest back in the tin and closed the lid. $180 for the ground this season. The debt keeps the rest. If you find more work than money, you find it with your hands. She reached across for a slate offcut to weigh the page down, and Lenora took it up to pass to her, and the wrist gave under the flat weight of it. The slate came down on the boards. Neither of them remarked on it. Lenora flexed the fingers open and shut until they answered, and Inez wrote the figure in ink so it could not be argued with, and that was the household limit set and accepted. Lenora did not fix the hill for 3 days. She read it. She marked where the roof dripped in the rain and where it dripped after. She pushed a rod into the upper slope and found the wet band, and followed it on hands and knees to where it dove beneath the house. She read the moss, which grew in lines, and the lines told her where water had run for 50 years. She watched where Rook lay in the heat of the afternoon, and he chose the same strip against the library wall every time, because the ground there stayed cool when the rest baked. That told her the most of anything. On the second day, she found the boulder, a gray rock the size of a stove, sitting in full sun above the vineyard. The earth around it cracked to dust. She set the bar under its downhill edge, threw her weight on it, and it rolled once and stopped. The soil beneath was not dust. It was dark loam, cool and close, root thread still holding the shape of moisture in it, and a breath of coolness rose off it into the hot air. Rook was in the hollow before she straightened, curling belly down into the fresh shade. She pressed her palm flat to the ground and held it there. This was the thing the men who had divided the estate could not see because they had never learned to look for it. The hill was not rich. Ezra had never claimed rich soil healed anything. He had claimed the reverse. The hill only held. It held what little the sky gave, long enough for a root to drink before the water drained away, and it held it only if the walls above were built to let water leave and not to trap it. That was the whole inheritance. It fit in a torn notebook and a rolled stone, and the men who took the spring and the bottom and the brand had left it lying here for the one heir who would kneel in the dust to find it. She drove the first stake. Then she began to build. The West Bank breastwall came first, because the creeping soil was already reaching for the library's hidden air inlet, and a choked inlet meant the manor's lungs closed, 54 feet along the contour, 4 feet at the center. She dug the footing down to firm ground and set the largest stones deepest, bedded flat, each on its natural bed the way Ezra had shown her and Thomas after him. She laid the faces flat outward. She battered the whole wall back into the hill, an inch of lean for every foot of height, so the earth pushing on it would drive it into itself instead of out. Through stones ran the full thickness at intervals, binding the two faces into one wall rather than two skins that would peel apart. She left the joints open behind, on purpose, so the water would find a door already made and take it. Inez held the line and the mended plumb bob and called the face true or called it proud, and where it ran proud, Lenora reset it. It was slow work. The wrist flared in the cold of each morning, and she taped it and shifted the heaviest stones with the bar and a tripod of lashed poles rather than force them and pay for it later. When a short stretch was up, she poured 3 buckets behind it and watched. The water darkened the open joints and came through low and clean, and the face did not move under her hand, and she let herself believe the method was sound. By the 4th day the wall stood, and to anyone on the road below, it looked like a thing a mason had made. Amos Drennan was on the road below on the 5th day. He struck the bottom course once with his boot, the way he struck every rail he passed, and he laughed at the sound it made, and he carried the laugh back down to Coe's store. By nightfall, the wall had a name to go with the one the manor already wore, the widow's staircase. A widow, Amos told anyone who would stand for it, draining a cliff with a ruler. Everett came up himself 2 mornings after, sitting his horse at the foot of the wall to see whether she was ready yet to be sensible and sell. Nathaniel rode a length behind him and stayed there. "While you measure damp stone," Everett said, "we'll be growing food." He rubbed his thumb along his hat brim and looked at the wall and then away from it, the way he had looked away from her at the table. She knew the shape of his grudge and did not name it to him. 4 years back, Ambrose had refused to sell Everett the same slope because Everett meant to strip the vines and pull the willow belt and run cattle over the bones of it. Ambrose had said no. Everett had never forgiven the ground for being kept from him, and now the ground was hers, which was worse. Nathaniel said nothing on the hill, but a wagon of split oak had come to Greyhaven days earlier with no note, and Lenora had known it by its blue paint, which was his. Under the last row of wood lay a card, a buyer in town, willing to take the manor cheap. Firewood, and a way out in the same load. She burned the oak against the cold and sent the card back unsigned, and she said nothing of it to either brother then or ever. The rain came on a Tuesday, not a storm. A soft, steady April rain, half a day of it, the kind of water the ground could take. Lenora stood under the eave and watched it leave her terrace slower than it came and leave it clearer. The runoff below the new wall, almost clean where the bare slope beside it ran brown. It was working. For one evening, she let herself believe it was working. Rook told her otherwise before she saw it. In the morning, he would not lie at the center of the wall. He circled the strip he loved and stood off it and watched the stone. Lenora laid her palm flat against the center face. The stones there did not sit like a wall. They moved together, a whole section breathing outward as one, where a sound wall lets each stone carry its own weight and hold still. 12 feet of it had pushed out from the hill. She saw it now that she was looking, the belly in the line, the daylight opening at a joint. And the joint ran unbroken from the footing to the cap. One long vertical seam she had let happen without seeing it, and the footing stones under that stretch were the small ones, the ones she had bedded early before her hand found its rhythm, too small to carry 4 feet of wet hillside. Everett was on the road again below, and he saw her hand on the wall and read it right. "Stone still moves downhill," he called up, easy and certain. "You've only taught it to wait." She did not answer him. She crouched at the footing and worked her fingers into the joint, and felt how far it had opened since the soft rain, the gentle water, the water the ground was meant to take. The dangerous water had not come yet. One more hard rain against that belly, against that unbroken seam and those undersized stones, and the center of the wall would tear open in the night and go down the hill. She took the 12 feet apart the way it had gone up, one stone at a time, in the order it would come, no anger in her hands. She lifted each stone off the failing section and set it on the grass in a row, and she looked at each one as it came away, learning from the fit it had held and the fit it had lost. The small footing stones she set apart from the rest, because they had a use, but not here, not under a wall. 2 days of her own work undone, and Inez wrote the 2 days in the column where lost days went, and neither of them called it a loss out loud. It was a payment. That was a different thing, and both women knew it. Everett had left an offer behind him on the road the week before, delivered through Amos, a wagon of milled posts, cheap, to prop the bulging face and be done with it, timber driven at an angle against the belly, and the wall would stand another season looking like a wall. Posts would only hide the mistake until stronger water found it, Lenora said, and sent the offer back the way it had come. She rebuilt it wider than before. She opened the footing trench deeper, down past the loose fill to the firm ground beneath, and she brought up the largest bedded rocks she had for the base, and let them sit a hand's breadth wider than the first course had. The small stones she worked back into the general fill behind the wall, where a small stone bore no load and could do no harm. Every joint she staggered now, laying each stone to cross the seam of the 2 below it, so that no crack ran 2 full courses without a stone laid over it to break the line. Through the whole stretch, she drove the long binding stones, the through stones, reaching from the outer face clean back into the hill, tying the 2 skins of the wall into one body. The batter she steepened, 1.25 inches of lean now for every foot she rose, letting the whole weight of the wet hill press the wall into itself. When the section stood again, she tested it before she trusted it. She poured 3 barrels of water into the ground behind the wall and stood back and watched. The water darkened the open joints and came weeping through them low and clean, down onto the grass at the wall's foot, and she pressed her palm flat to the center face and held it there through the whole draining and felt nothing move, not the section, not a single stone in it, each one holding its own weight, the wall standing dead still under a load that had torn its first self open. That was the difference between a wall that stands and a wall that is only standing. And Inez, who had heard Tomas name the difference 100 times, said nothing, but she watched Lenora's hand on the stone and nodded once. The cost of the rebuild was set down plain. No new tools that month. The froe Lenora wanted for splitting stakes waited, and she split them with a wedge and a maul and lost time to it. Inez drew the tool allowance down. Lenora picked splinters from the heel of her palm at the kitchen table by lamplight and worked the swelling in the old wrist joint with her thumb and said nothing about either, and the wrist would not close all the way for the better part of a week. Then she went at the terraces, because a wall holds nothing if the ground above it is not built to feed water to it gently, a little at a time, instead of loosing it all at once. She restored the 6 old contour rows first, the ones buried 20 years under brush. Where a lip had slumped, she reset the fallen stone. Where the row still held true, she left it, and was glad of the hands that had first laid it. Into the planting pockets she built the soil up in layers, the way Tomas's letters described and her father's habit agreed. Coarse brush at the bottom for air and for drainage, then a course of old dry stems, then weathered manure, then at last the fine wash soil a root would take hold in. Across the whole surface she laid a blanket of flat loose stone, thick as a spread hand, to hold the moisture down in the soil against the pull of the sun. She spaced the annual crops wide, wider than any valley farmer would have dared, because a plant set close to its neighbor is a plant made to fight for water, and in a dry year the fighting kills them both. The mission vines she pruned back hard to the living wood, cutting away years of feral cane so the root could spend its strength on a few good spurs and not 100 starving ones. Beans and squash went into the pockets, and a little barley for Penny's winter forage, and Inez counted every seed into every hole and wrote the number in the book before it was covered, so that in autumn the survivors could be set against the sowing and made to tell the exact truth of what the ground had done. Phoebe Larkin came up the hill in the middle of that work, the first of the neighbors to climb the bluff for any reason but to laugh. She kept 11 acres of pear trees down the basin on soil as hard as Lenora's own, and she carried a pruning knife in her apron pocket and drew it out to trim a broken cane on a vine without asking leave, which told Lenora what kind of woman had come up her road. "I heard you had wine to sell," Phoebe said. "2 barrels, they say at the store." "Inez keeps the cellar," Lenora said. "She'll name you a price." Phoebe looked at the stone mulch and the wide pockets and the hard-pruned vines, and she did not laugh, but she did not believe either. She crouched and worked 2 fingers down into the soil beneath a flat surface stone and drew them out with dark grit clinging to them, cool grit, and she looked at it a long moment. Then she stood and brushed her knees and named the price she'd pay for the barrels and went back down the hill. She was not converted, but she had felt the cool soil under the stone with her own hand, and Lenora had watched her feel it, and that was the seed of a kind, put in the ground without a word said over it. The hauling road undid a week not long after. The dense stone Lenora needed for the lower drains lay at the foot of the bluff, and the old approach up to the terraces was straight and steep, cut long ago by men who had hauled nothing heavier than a saddle up it. To sled dressed stone up a grade like that, she should have laid a switchback first, a long zigzag that traded distance for a gentler pitch, but a switchback meant 3 days she did not think she had, with the planting season closing on her, and so she kept the steep pitch and told herself she would take it slow and light. She took it slow. It did not matter. The loaded sled started down a short grade under half a load to fetch a second stone, and the drag chain skipped a link on a slick of wet clay, and in the skip the load lunged forward and pulled the mare with it. Penny's hind feet slid back toward the raw lip of the bluff, her whole weight thrown against the breeching, her neck cranked around, and her eyes gone white-ringed. Lenora had the axe out of the sled bed and swinging before she had decided to move. One blow on the taut chain, then a second, and the parted chain sang away over the edge and the load went with it and burst on the rocks 100 feet below. Penny came up hard against the cut bank on the uphill side and stood there, all four legs splayed, shaking from the shoulder down. The sled was stove in. The chain was gone over the edge with the stone. But Lenora spent the whole of that day not on what she'd lost, but on the mare, running both hands slowly down each leg from the shoulder and the hip to the hoof, feeling every joint for heat and swelling, walking Penny a dozen slow turns on the flat to find the catch in her stride. She found it in the near hind, a strain that would keep the mare from any load for 8 days, and she rested her the 8 days and did not shave them to 7. And she hauled no more stone until she had cut the switchback the next morning, laying stone tread at each turn, and made herself the rule she should have started with. No loaded descent without a drag shoe wedged under the runner, and a second hand on the brake rope wherever the grade steepened. That evening she stitched a folded pad of blanket under the harness where the breeching had bitten into the mare's haunch, and she did it without a word about it to anyone, and Inez wrote, "Rode 8 days in the lost days column, and let the 2 words carry the whole of it." The trial crop failed in July, and this failure Lenora had earned by not yet knowing enough, which is the only honest kind. The beans came up and grew a hand high, and then the leaves yellowed the wrong way from the bottom leaves up, in ground that felt damp to the touch and should have been feeding them. Lenora dug below a whole row to find the reason she did not want to find. She had built the planting pockets deep with fine soil, believing that deeper soil would hold more water and cradle the roots. But beneath the fine soil, the subsoil was hard clay that no root and no water could pass, and the cellar drain outlet that should have carried off the excess sat higher than the root zone it was meant to serve. So the water she had meant to hold had nowhere to go. It stood there, perched above the clay, drowning the roots in the wet dark. She pulled a plant, and the roots came up black and soft. She had built a bowl and called it a bed. Amos Drennan heard of the yellow rose before the week was out, and rode up to say, "I told you so," from the saddle, striking the top rail of the terrace fence with his boot as he passed it. And for once he was not entirely wrong, and Lenora said as much to his face. "You're right that they rotted," she told him. "You're wrong about the why. It wasn't the hill, it was me. I laid it wrong, and the water had no door." That took the pleasure clean out of it for him, an admission he could not turn into a joke, and he rode back down the hill with less to carry to the store than he had ridden up with. She dug up every surviving row herself, rather than lay the blame on the seed. 4 bushels of seed gone into black rot, 27 days of growth wasted, and the first mortgage payment thrown into doubt by the loss. Inez sold 2 of the 11 sound wine barrels earlier than she had meant to hold the payment whole, and she wrote the early sale in red so the price of the mistake would show. Then Lenora rebuilt the pockets the way they should have been built the first time. Coarse gravel below for the water to run through. The drain outlet dropped so it sat under the root zone and drew the excess down and away instead of leaving it to stand. An open inspection box she could lift the lid of and reach a hand into, and a shallower bed of good soil laid over fractured stone so the roots could reach the moisture without drowning in it. She emptied a full wash tub into the corrected row and crouched and watched the water go down through it and out through the dropped outlet and leave the soil dark but not standing, not a puddle anywhere in it. In the notebook she wrote only the facts: the depth of the gravel, the drop of the outlet in inches, the day. There is no column in an honest ledger for an excuse. Edwin Shaw came in September, and he came to disprove her. He was the county surveyor, 52 years old, a former railroad grade man who carried his level in a fitted wooden case and set it down on the ground as gently as a man sets down a sleeping child. Everett had filed a complaint against her at the county seat. The widow's channel, he swore under his name, was gathering runoff and throwing it down onto the wagon road, cutting the crossing where it forded. Shaw had ridden up to measure the truth of the charge, expecting, by his own manner, to find a woman who had made a costly mess of a hillside she had no business working. Lenore gave him the run of the place and did not walk at his elbow explaining herself. She let him set his tripod and level the instrument and send his rod up and down her contours, and she answered what he asked her and stood off the rest of the time and let the ground do its own talking. She had learned that much from her father, that a wall argues better than its builder. Shaw found the error before noon. He set his rod at the head of the upper collector and read it, and walked the line to the western end and read it there, and the numbers told him what her eye had missed. The long, shallow trench she had cut to catch the hillside seepage and carry it clear of the foundation fell only 2 inches across its whole 160 feet. She had laid it by eye and a water pan level, and over that distance her eye had lied to her. The western end lay so near to dead level that it made no difference to water, and instead of carrying the seepage out to the sandstone apron the way she had drawn it, the line held the water and let it soak backward toward the very foundation she had dug the trench to keep dry. Lenora did not defend the line. She asked one question, and only one. Where should the outlet stand? Shaw looked up from his rod, because that was not the question he was used to being asked by the people whose work he condemned. 7 inches lower at the west end, he said. Reset your center grade to carry a steady fall the whole run. No flat stretches, no dips. Put clean out boxes at the low points where you can lift the tile and see whether it's running or standing. Then he folded his rod and walked the rebuilt breast wall and ran a hand along its battered face and along the through-stone ends and walked the corrected terraces above it and read them too, all of it, before he set his instrument down and gave his verdict where any man on the road might hear it. The first wall was wrong, Shaw said. The later ones are not. He said more, for the record, because Everett's complaint was on paper and had to be answered on paper. The widow was not increasing the total water crossing Willow Bend. The hill shed what it had always shed, only slower and cleaner. Her collector was misplaced, and she knew it, and she would fix it. Her spillway principle, dividing dangerous water and putting it down onto bare rock, was sound in its design. Her lower outlet was as yet unproven, and he would want to see it stand a real storm before he'd put his name under it. But she was stealing no water and cutting no road, and Everett Harrow's complaint would be entered as without merit. Everett heard the whole of it. He had ridden up expecting to sit his horse and watch the surveyor set the widow straight, and he had come no farther than the foot of the road, where he'd reined in behind Shaw's parked wagon out of the line of sight from the wall. He stood there in the wagon's shadow, while a man he could not accuse of taking her side said her later work was right and his complaint was wrong. He rubbed his thumb along the brim of his hat, once, slow. Then he turned his horse quietly and rode down the hill, and he was gone before Lenora came around the end of the wagon, so that she never knew that day that he had been there at all, or that he had heard. She reopened 90 feet of the collector to set it right. She lifted the salvaged clay tile out of the trench by hand, every length of it drawn up whole and set aside unbroken, and she reset the grade to a true and steady fall, and dropped the west outlet the 7 inches Shaw had named, and put in the clean-out boxes at the low points. 3 terrace days went to it that she could not spare, and the wrist was the worse for all the lifting. And when she asked Merritt Co. at the store for a little credit against the cost of the fix, he refused her across the counter. She had a payment due, he said, and until it was in his hand, he would sell her flour for coin and nothing on the book. She paid him coin. She loaded her own tile onto her own wagon and hauled it up herself. The first harvest came in October, small and sufficient, the way a first harvest ought to be. 39 crates of grapes off the restored vines, 7 bushels of beans from the second planting, the corrected one, the one built over gravel, 43 squash, 16 bundles of barley cured for Penny's winter, 11 sound old wine barrels confirmed and inventoried down in the breathing cellar. Inez set every number in its place in the ledger, and Lenora hauled the grapes and produce down the long county track to sell, and 2 of the old barrels went to Merritt to broker for what a broker's cut left of them. And when it was all reckoned at the end, she paid $320 against the mortgage principal and 20 more against the interest and the fees. There was nothing left after it. No stove for the parlor, which stayed shut and cold. No glass for the west wing windows, which stayed boarded. They ate the harvest meal in the one warm room, and no one at the table called it a victory because it was not one. It was enough. And enough was its own hard word. Inez wrote in the ledger what the harvest had covered, and beside it, in the same plain hand, she wrote what it had not, so that the true shape of the year would keep through the winter, and not soften in the memory into something better than it was. The system was half proven, the debt was half answered. The manor was still cold, Everett still held the road in the spring, and Lenora sat by the lamp through the early winter with Ambrose's chart spread flat, and knew there was a thing on it she had not yet found in the ground. The plan showed water leaving the property low on the bluff at a place where she could find no channel at all, walk it as she might. Water does not leave by a door that is not there. Either the chart was wrong, or she had not yet learned to see the door, and the chart so far had been wrong about nothing. The winter passed, and it did not pass in a blur, because Lenora did not let it. Inez read the cistern on the first of every month and wrote the depth. Lenora repointed the worst of the north face joints with lime she slaked herself, choosing the mild days for it, working the fresh mortar into the raked seams and striking it back to shed water. They turned the 11 sound barrels and topped them against the air and marked the 2 that had begun to fall away. She sharpened the tools that were left to sharpen. On the settlement stakes she'd driven behind the rebuilt wall, she read the wall's movement against the plumb marks the first of each month, and month after month the marks held true, and the wall had not stirred a hair, and she wrote the holding down each time because a thing that refuses to move is as much a measurement as a thing that fails. In February she found the key to the plan chest, wedged behind one of Tomas's templates, where he had left it against the day someone would need it, and she opened the chest, and the door she had been hunting all winter opened with it. The chest held Ambrose's whole unfinished scheme, drawn to scale in a fine surveyor's hand, an uphill interceptor, which she had half built by instinct without ever seeing his drawing of it. 2 cisterns, one of them the buried second one she had already cleared. A rubble drain ringed clear around the library foundation to carry off the seep that fed the breathing shaft. The contour terraces laid just where the old rows ran, and 3 spillways meant to divide dangerous stormwater and lay it down onto bare rock where it could do no harm, of which exactly one had ever been finished. Across one course of the plan ran a red line, and beside it, in Ambrose's own hand, "Do not close this course." Someone had closed it. Later landscaping, some tidy hand in the years between, had filled and buried the very channel the chart insisted must be kept open. And that was the door low on the bluff that seemed to lead to nowhere, because it had been stopped up and grassed over and forgotten. There were letters in the chest as well, from Tomas to Ambrose, and they did not read the way the basin talked about the man. The valley called Ambrose the eccentric, who dug tunnels for reasons of his own, a wasteful old fool obsessed with old wine and holes in the ground. But Tomas's letters gave the terraces to older hands than Ambrose's, to the California vineyard workers and the immigrant diggers before them who had first read this slope and set the first dry stone rows across it, generations back, long before a harrow held the deed. Ambrose had inherited a beginning. He had understood it, which was rarer than beginning it, and he had meant to finish it, and had run out of years and out of sons willing to kneel in the dust and read water. He had not invented the hill. He had only been the last man before Lenora to see plainly what it was. She went out into the thaw and found the old rows under the sagebrush where the letters said they would be. Dry stone terrace remnants, the stones bedded flat and true by hands long dead. Mission vines gone feral, but still rooted in the ground the terraces had held for them. Willow wattling half rotted into the soil it had bound. A collapsed stone chute, and the throat of an old springhouse channel choked with silt. The ancients had built here, and it had taken Lenora a full year of her own failures to understand why they had chosen this slope and no other. Because the slope caught the seep off the higher ground, and a slope that catches the seep will feed a wall that lets water leave and starve a crop behind a wall that traps it. The knowledge was not new. It was older than the harrows, older than the deed. She was only the newest to carry it up the hill. March came in dry. The winter rain had ended early, weeks before its time, and the far higher ridge showed thin bare rock where in most years it should have shown deep snow into April. Lenora read the sign and did not like it. Everett's upper spring, the one struck from her deed, dropped 6 weeks before he looked for it to drop. The family ditch that watered the wheat bottom showed exposed mud by the end of April, a full month ahead of any ordinary year. The morning dew was already thinning by the middle of May. And Merritt Coe, when Lenora asked him plainly whether the September deadline might bend if the year turned hard, told her across the counter that it would not bend a single day. The basin read the same signs Lenora read and did the opposite of what she did. Everett looked at a failing spring and decided the cure for dry was more grazing, more ground, more stock. He put his men to clearing the willow belt above his pasture to open the shaded ground for cattle, and he deepened the straight drainage trench below the cleared slope to reclaim the wet corner of it for grass, and he bought more cattle while the price was low, reasoning that a dry year would break the men who lost their nerve and reward the man who held his. Nathaniel plowed 40 more acres of wheat on the low ground nearest the failing channel, chasing the last of the moisture, and he warned Everett more than once that the straight trench was gathering the smaller channels into itself rather than spreading their water, and he went on plowing all the same. Amos Drennan kept more cattle than his one trough could carry and told the men at the store that the widow was drawing back because a widow, in the end, had no nerve for a dry year. Lenora drew back. She planted fewer annual crops, not more. She pruned the old vines harder still, down to fewer spurs. She widened both spillways and deepened only the pockets she had come to trust, and she extended the stone mulch across the ground she meant to keep. She cleared and repaired the second cistern and opened its buried mouth to catch what water the year would give. She stored her seed down in the cool cellar before she sold a single crate of produce, so that whatever the summer did to the standing crop, the next year's planting was already safe under stone. And she left one whole terrace bare and planted nothing in it at all, good ground standing empty, so that when the violent water finally came, it would have a place to lay down its silt without tearing through a crop to reach it. Inez looked at the empty terrace and the wide-spaced rows and asked the question a careful woman was bound to ask. "That's good ground standing bare. You could put 40 plants in it. Every extra plant becomes another mouth asking for water, Lenora said. I don't have water for 40 more mouths. I have it for the ones already here, and only if I'm careful with every drop. The ledger held the whole shape of the year in figures, and the shape was this. Every man in Alder Rain Basin had widened his reach against the coming dry, thrown more ground and more stock into the path of it, on the faith that more was the answer to less. And one woman on the worst ground in the basin had pulled her reach in close, strengthened what she already held, and left good soil bare on purpose. The ditch showed mud a month early. The spring was already failing at the source. The snow had never come to the ridge at all. And in the whole of the basin, nobody was building for the dry year but her. 6 mornings running, the cloth came in dry. Inez had hung a square of clean wool on the pea-wire each night since the middle of May, the way her husband had taught her to read a coming dry. A wet cloth at dawn meant dew, and dew meant the air still had water to give the ground for free. She wrung the first morning's cloth and got nothing but the damp of her own hand. The second morning, nothing. By the 26th of May, she had 6 dry mornings written in a row in the margin of the ledger, and she went into the cellar and moved the small sum she had been holding back for a parlor stove and window glass, and she wrote it under feed. Furniture would not carry a horse through a dry autumn. Barley would. It's begun, Inez said, and Lenora did not ask her what. Phoebe Larkin came up the bluff the first week of June, and this time she came without a wagon to fill. She found Lenora at the empty terrace, the one planted with nothing, and Lenora took up 3 handfuls of soil to show her the way her father had once shown her. One from behind the lower wall, one from Everett's cleared pasture that Phoebe had crossed on the way up, one from the bare bluff face where nothing had been worked at all. The soil from behind the wall she squeezed in her palm and opened, and it held its shape, a cool, dark ball with the print of her fingers in it. The pasture soil broke apart when she opened her hand, dry crumbs falling through her fingers. The bare bluff soil never made a ball at all. It ran out of her fist as dust, and the wind took the last of it off her open palm. Phoebe watched all 3. She did not laugh, and this time she did not just feel the cool grit and go home. She looked at the wall above the good soil, and at the stone mulch, and at the pruned vines standing green in a June that had already yellowed the valley grass. How did you set it? Phoebe said. Not does it work. How is it placed? On the contour, Lenora said. Every stone on its bed. The water gets a door before it makes one. Phoebe nodded slowly and did not buy anything, because she had not come to buy, and went back down thinking about doors. Nathaniel measured the spring in the 2nd week of June, though it was not his spring to measure. It fed Everett's stock trough through the pipe struck from Lenora's deed, and it had run, in an ordinary June, 14 pails to the hour, enough for a herd and a garden both. Nathaniel filled a pail and counted the minutes and did the sum, and it was running 3 pails to the hour and falling. He carried the number to his brother. He told Everett that a spring at 3 pails and dropping would not water the cattle he had, let alone the cattle he had bought, and that the thing to do while there was still grass anywhere was to sell down the herd before every other man in the basin sold his on the same week and broke the price. Everett rubbed his thumb along his hat brim and said the spring had come back before and would come back again. He did not sell. Up on the bluff, Lenora pushed her measuring rod into the deepest planting pocket, down through the stone mulch and the shallow soil, and drew it out, and the last 3 inches came up dark and cool. She wrote the depth in the notebook. The valley grass had gone to straw, and the spring was down to 3 pails, and her own vines stood green, and none of it, yet, had proven a thing to anyone who did not already believe. The dry had not delivered its verdict. It had only begun collecting evidence. The evidence came in on the 4th of July in a shower that lasted the length of an afternoon. A quarter-inch fell. Lenora read it off the tin rain gauge nailed to the cistern post, 1/4 of 1 inch, the first rain in weeks and the last for a long time. Edwin Shaw was on the Bluff Road when it came, riding through on county business, and he stopped to watch what the two hillsides did with the same water. Off Everett's cleared pasture, the runoff came red, bare soil lifting and running, the water carrying the ground away with it down toward the straight trench. Off Lenora's spillway, the overflow came slower and near clear, spreading onto the sandstone apron and sinking or leaving without a load of soil in it. 3 days later, Shaw came back with his rod and measured what the empty terrace had caught. 1 1/4 inches of fresh silt, laid down soft behind the brush layer, soil that would have gone to the creek off any other ground in the basin. Shaw wrote it in his own book, and what he wrote was that the works did not steal water. They broke the force of it and kept the soil the force would have carried off. It was the first thing he had put in writing that took her side without a complaint forcing him to. But the same shower found a mistake, and Lenora found it before the storm could. She had lined the second spillway, days before, with a laminated bluff stone that lay close to hand and split flat and easy. Inez had left one sample in a bucket of water overnight. She did that now with any stone Lenora meant to trust, and in the morning she struck it with the small hammer, and it did not ring. It separated. It came apart into thin, wet sheets in her hand like a book swollen in the rain. Set in a spillway, soaked and struck by storm water and the stone the storm carried, it would flake away and become debris inside its own outlet and choke the very channel it was meant to keep open. Lenora pulled every stone of it before a storm could prove the fault for her. 4 days' work discarded, she hauled dense, rounded field stone up the rebuilt switchback from the creek bed instead, a longer haul, a harder stone to lay, and locked it between larger side stone so nothing could shift it. When Inez soaked a sample of the new stone overnight and struck it in the morning, it rang clear and stayed whole. The cost of the change was 1 planned terrace extension canceled and 6 fewer rows of vine set out that spring, and Lenora entered both in the notebook and did not mourn them. A spillway that fails in a storm costs more than 6 rows of vine. By the middle of July, the basin was talking, and the talk had changed. Merritt Co. changed it without meaning to. Inez had carried down a sealed jar of soil from behind the lower wall and set it on the store counter beside a jar from the wheat bottom that a farmer had left as proof of how hard his own ground had gone. 2 days on, the wheat bottom jar had dried pale to the glass. The bluff jar still showed dark moisture 2 full days longer, sealed the same, sitting in the same window. Merritt looked at the 2 jars a long time. He would not extend the widow's credit. That had not changed, and would not until the note was paid. But he told her he would broker her coming wine when it was made, and take his broker's cut, and not take the wine or the cellar as security against the debt. It was the first hand he had loosened on her. Amos Drennan changed his own mind harder, because he had further to come. 54 days had passed without rain by the last week of July. Lenora had the count in the ledger, day on day, a mark for each dry dawn. She pushed the rod into the lower pocket, and it came up damp at 11 inches down. 86 of every 100 of her restored vines still stood green and leafed. Of the untended vines on the ground outside her system, fewer than a third had a green leaf left on them. Amos rode up to see it, because a man who had mocked a thing that long has to see the truth for himself before he can carry it, and he crouched and pushed his own thumb into the damp at 11 inches and said nothing for a while. Then he sold half his herd that week, at a poor price before the price got worse, and he stopped saying widow's staircase in the store, not from any change of heart he'd have named aloud. He had felt cool, damp soil under his thumb in the 54th rainless day, and there was no joke left in it. Everett came up the bluff at the end of July to buy. He came in daylight, on his horse, with money in his coat, and he made his offer plainly, the way a man makes an offer he thinks is fair. He would buy half the cellar's stock and all the wine she had, sound and new both, at a price he named that was not a bad price. It would put coin in her hand against the September note and take some of the risk off her, he said. He believed it a reasonable thing. He rubbed his hat brim while he said it, which she had learned to read. Lenora refused him, not from spite. The cellar and the drains and the breathing shaft and the bluff were one property, one system, and to sell the wine was to sell a piece of a machine that only worked whole. She could not explain the whole of that to a man who saw a cellar as a room with barrels in it, and she did not try. Ambrose would have sold, Everett said, for the right figure. He had one, Lenora said. Everett did not understand her at first, and then he did. Ambrose had had a figure, and had held to it against Everett 4 years back when Everett came to buy this same slope. Everett put his hat back on and rode down without the wine. He came back at night, 11 days later, and he came without money in his hand. He stood at the foot of the hill in the dark with no rope, no barrel, no wagon behind him, nothing to carry a purchase away in. And Lenora came down with the lamp and understood before he spoke that he had not come to buy anything. He had lost 2 calves that week at the failing spring, gone down in the mud where the water used to stand, and the herd he would not sell was drinking a spring at less than 3 pails to the hour, and there was no grass on the ground he had cleared. He did not ask outright. A proud man does not. He said he'd lost the calves, and then he stood there, and the standing there was the asking. Inez had done the arithmetic already, because Inez did the arithmetic before the need arrived at the door. She came out with the notebook and read it in the lamplight. They could spare 9 bundles of the cured barley, 2 barrels of cistern water, and 1 sack of beans, and no more than that, without cutting into Penny's winter feed, or the seed already stored, or the water the 2 of them needed to reach the next rain, not a bundle more. She named the exact figures to Everett's face, so that it was measured charity and not pity, a thing counted out of a ledger and not flung from a full hand. The cost of it went into the same book. The parlor stove came off the list again, for good this time. 2 hired hauling days she had meant to buy in autumn were struck, and she and Inez ate from the cellar's own reserve for 11 days to make the sack of beans go up the hill instead of into their own pot. Inez wrote all of it down and did not complain of the price, then or after. Everett took the barley and the beans and the water. Before he turned to go, he stopped, and he asked the one thing he had truly come up the hill to ask, the thing a man asks only of someone whose judgment he has started, against his will, to trust. If the first rain brings more than your walls can hold, Everett said, what then? No wall gets to be certain before the storm, Lenora said. He went down into the dark. Some morning that week before dawn, a single dense creek stone appeared beside the unfinished spillway, set down where the next course wanted it, heavier than any stone Inez could have carried, and none of Lenora's own hauling. Lenora looked at it a while in the early light. She did not ask who had carried it up the hill in the night. She already knew, and knowing it, she did not say it, because a thing given without a name is spoiled by naming it. The proving harvest came in September, off less ground than the year before, and it proved everything. Phoebe Larkin came for it, and she came for knowledge and not for fruit. She had a wagon, but she left it at the bottom and climbed up with a 12-foot level board and a bundle of stakes over her shoulder. Lenora laid the board across the line Phoebe meant to plant her orchard diversion on and read the fall, 2 inches over the 12 feet toward a shelf of exposed rock, which was where the water would want to leave if a channel let it. Phoebe drove her stakes on the reading and went home with the stakes set and no fruit bought. Fruit may fail once, Phoebe said before she went. Soil should not have to. Then the counts. Off the strengthened ground, 58 crates of grapes, more than the wet year had given, 12 bushels of beans, 61 squash, 28 bundles of barley cured for winter, seed reserved and stored before a crate went to market, and from the cellar, blended with the new pressing, 7 barrels of marketable wine. Down the basin, Nathaniel brought in less than half the wheat he had plowed for. Everett was buying feed at a dry year price. Amos had sold his cattle in July. Phoebe had lost most of a year's fruit, but kept the soil her young pear roots stood in. Merritt Coe waited at the store, and he set Inez's ledger down open on the counter beside his own book and went down the 2 columns together. The figures reconciled to the penny. When the wine sold and the produce sold, there was enough to clear the principal and the interest both, the whole of the 1,180 and the year's charges on it. Merritt drew 1 line through the balance and wrote paid once beneath it in ink, and did not say much because there was not much a man could add. The numbers told the story more honestly than pride ever could. Lenora had said nothing to convert a single doubter. The jar, the rod, the 11 inches of damp, the reconciled columns, the ground, and the ledger had converted them for her, one at a time, and she had only had to be right and let them come to it. Shaw was in the store when the line was drawn. He had ridden in ahead of weather, and before anyone could leave, he said what he had come in to say. There were thunderheads building beyond Cinderback Ridge, tall ones, the first real cloud in 2 months, and a hard rain onto ground baked 54 days dry was not the gentle rain the hill was built to drink. A hard storm after a drought is the dangerous one, Shaw said. The ground has forgotten how to drink. It'll shed the first of it downhill faster than any soft winter rain, and everything downhill of the shedding had better be ready for it. Lenora rode home and did not sleep. There was 1 day, perhaps 2, and a list of things unfinished, and she divided the hours the way she divided everything, by what the storm would test first. She reset the second spillway lip with the Sound Creek stone, Everett stone laid into the run of it. She had Inez move the stored seed and Ambrose's papers up off the cellar floor to the high shelf, above any water that might reach the lower chamber. She cleared the upper collector's clean-out boxes of the dry leaves that had drifted into them, because a jammed clean-out in a storm is a burst wall. She opened the roof overflow. Nathaniel came up and cleared the Manor road of a slide of loose stone, and worked most of a morning at it, and did not once say that Everett had told him to come, though Everett had. Phoebe brought a load of empty grain sacks for temporary checks to throw across a lip if one began to run over. Shaw walked the ground with Lenora and marked with a driven stake the one safe place to cut an emergency release if the worst came, a line straight down onto bare bedrock, where a knife of water could do no harm. What she finished, the upper cleanouts cleared, the seed and papers raised, the first apron reinforced, the roof overflow open. What she did not finish, the widening of the lower road culvert, which was 3 feet wide and 2 feet high, and had never yet carried more than an ordinary rain. The second relief arch she had drawn but not cut, and the last 20 feet of the terrace wall on the far end, which stood at half height with its capstones stacked beside it, waiting for hands she ran out of time to give them. Down the hill, Everett spent the same day making the storm worse. He put his men to deepening the straight trench below the cleared pasture, cutting it straighter and deeper still, on the reasoning that a deep straight ditch would carry the storm water off his ground fast, down to the creek, and spare his reclaimed grass. Nathaniel told him what he had told him in June and April both, that the trench did not carry water, it collected it, that a dozen smaller runnels off the cleared slope fed into it, and the trench gathered them into one weight of water and aimed it downhill. Shaw, riding out, stopped at the trench and looked down its straight throat and said it plainer than Nathaniel could. "That ditch will not carry the water," Shaw said. "It will collect it, and then it will become a knife." Everett looked at the newly reclaimed pasture that filling the trench would drown, and he would not fill it. Not the evening before a storm, to lose the grass he had cleared the willow belt to make. He left it open, straight and deep, aimed down the hollow that ran toward the foot of Lenora's bluff. The first drops came at dusk the next day. They struck the sun-heated stone of the manor steps and hissed, vanished, struck and hissed, and were gone, the dry stone drinking the first of it as fast as it fell, and for a moment it looked like nothing. Then the sky came open the way it had not come open in 2 years, hard and straight down, more water in an hour than the ground had seen in months, and the baked earth stopped drinking and started shedding. On the cleared pasture the water did not soak in at all. It ran, all of it, at once, gathering off the bare slope into the runnels, and the runnels into the straight trench. Up on the bluff, Lenora's high pockets took the first of the rain and held it, the stone mulch and the layered soil, drinking what a soft rain would have given. But it was not a soft rain, and within minutes the upper collector was running, water she had not seen in it since spring moving down the true grade Shaw had set, out toward the apron. Then the valley went. The straight trench filled and did not carry. It collected, the way 2 men had told Everett it would. The gathered water cut down into the trench floor, and the trench widened as it cut. And what had been a ditch became a channel, became a race. Fence posts along the pasture edge leaned, then walked, then went. The cattle broke and scattered uphill from the sound of it. On the wheat bottom, Nathaniel's straight furrows plowed downhill on the low ground, ran full, and became 40 channels pouring off the field, carrying the seed and the stubble and the top 3 inches of the soil down into the creek together. Part of the wagon road at the ford dropped into the water and was gone. From the bluff, over the roar of the rain, Lenora could hear a deeper sound underneath it, stone striking stone, the creek moving rock, the whole valley grinding downhill in the dark. The flood reached the hill on the 3rd wave. A branch came down the collector and jammed the head of the first spillway, and the water behind it began to back and climb toward the terrace lip. Lenora took the iron bar from where it leaned by the library door, the same bar she had opened the shelf with a year ago and a life ago, and drove it under the branch and threw her weight on it, and the branch tore loose and went over, and the water it had held transferred all at once onto the sandstone apron below, roaring and left onto bare rock instead of into the next wall. The corrected west wall took the shock of the surge and shuddered along its whole length and did not move, each stone holding its own, the water finding the open joints and leaving low and clean even now, under a weight it had never been asked to carry. Rook would not cross the 3rd terrace. He stood at the edge of it with his hackles up and his feet planted, and would not go over, and Lenora, who had learned to read the dog before she could read the wall, went to where he stood and looked. Water was rising behind the 3rd terrace, faster than the spillway below it could take it. The lip was near the top, and as she stood there in the driving rain with the lantern up, The face of the third terrace wall moved outward, out from the hill, the width of one of her own fingers, and held there for one long breath at the edge of going. The face held at the width of a finger, and then the spillway below it caught. The water backed against the third terrace found the lowered lip Shaw had set and went over it in a sheet, down onto the split apron, and the pressure came off the wall all at once. But it came off too late and too hard for the last 20 feet. The half-built stretch, the one with its capstones stacked beside it, and no time given to lay them. That section had never been finished, and it did not pretend to be. It tore out. 22 feet of wall let go from the hill and went down into the empty terrace below it, the one planted with nothing, and the water followed it in and spread across the bare receiving ground and stopped there, at the shelf of exposed rock, with nowhere lower to cut. The loss stopped where she had built a place for it to stop. The next wall down did not move. Lenora saw the section go and did not cheer the wall that held. She marked the failed 22 feet in her mind, the length of it, and the reason, and turned to the next thing, because the storm was not finished asking questions, and a builder who stops to admire an answer misses the next one coming. The next one came at the second channel. A whole limb, torn off something uphill, came down and lodged across the mouth of the second spillway, and the water stacked behind it fast. Lenora went to it with the lantern raised in one hand, and there was no time to fetch the bar from where she'd left it at the third terrace. The water was already climbing the lip. She tore at the branches by hand, wet wood and wet bark coming away in her fists, and behind her Penny, brought up to help drag stone and now standing too near the run, reared at a crack of stone under water, and Inez caught the halter and held her with both hands and her whole weight, boots sliding, and did not let go. The current came over the lip while Lenora had her arms in it. It hit her legs and took them out from under her, and threw her sideways against the spillway wall, and the lantern went out in the water, and for a breath there was only the roar and the cold and the stone against her back, and her bad wrist folding when she tried to push off it. Nathaniel came out of the dark and caught her coat. He had ridden up when the rain turned hard, without being asked, and he anchored the rope he carried around the stone pier at the library corner, and went in after her waist deep in the current, and he got a fist in her collar and hauled her back off the wall onto the footing. Her wrist would not close on the rope when he tried to put it in her hand. The old joint, the cold, the folding. So he wound the rope around her body instead, under her arms, and dragged her up onto the stone stair by it, and the two of them lay in the doorway of the breathing library out of the water, while the storm went on. Then Lenora understood the real fault, the one no test she had ever run could have shown her. The lower culvert, where the roof flow and the collector flow and the terrace overflow all came together to cross beneath the road, was not blocked. She had thought it blocked. It was not. It was full. Full to the crown of it and holding, because 3 feet wide and 2 feet high was the size of an ordinary rain. And this was not an ordinary rain, and everything the hill shed at once was arriving at a mouth built for a fraction of it. The water had nowhere to go but back, and it was backing up into the lower service passage, rising against the vault door, cutting into the road shoulder beside the choked mouth where it spilled out sideways. The culvert was too small. It had always been too small. The drought had baked the ground that made the rain shed all at once and find it out. She could not make it bigger in an hour in the dark. She made it a different thing instead. She took the bar to the top course of the culvert stone facing and pried it off, the upper course, to lift the crown and let more through, a hand's more, not enough. Then she went to Shaw's driven stake, the one he had marked in daylight for exactly this, and she cut the emergency side release he had sighted, hacking a channel through the road shoulder down onto the bare bedrock below, sacrificing a length of road on purpose so the water would leave where she chose, instead of tearing the whole road out where it chose. She pulled boards from the wine racks in the flooded passage and set them slantwise as a rough debris screen to keep the branches off the new opening. She took 20 feet of road herself, with her own hands in the bar, before the storm could take 200. And then Everett's trench answered, last and worst. The straight ditch below the cleared pasture had filled and cut and widened all through the storm, gathering the runnels into one weight. And now it let go. Not water alone, but a debris flow, water thick with soil and brush and rolling stone, coming down the hollow that ran to the foot of the bluff. It struck Greyhaven's lower approach with a sound Lenora felt through the stone she lay against. It buried the shed at the bottom. It took another length of the road. It shoved against the base of the hill and found the emergency release she had just cut and went down it onto the bedrock. Most of it spending its weight on rock that could not be carried off, and the rest spread wide across ground low enough and bare enough to take it. The manor stood. The library wall stood. The vault door held, and behind it the seed and the papers stayed dry on the high shelf. The upper collector held its grade. The corrected west wall held. The twin spillway apron held and ran. 5 of the 6 main terraces held. The 6th, the half-built one, had given its 22 feet into the empty ground on purpose. The second cistern held and filled. Every person on the hill lived, and Penny lived, and Rook came out from wherever a dog goes in a storm, and shook and lived. What the hill lost, it lost where Lenora had already known it was weak or had chosen to spend it. 22 feet of the unfinished wall. The lower service passage flooded. The road shoulder she had cut herself. The original culvert, overrun. 2 vineyard rows near the failed section. The empty shed. Several feet of garden soil off the low corner. Each wall accepted what it could hold. Each opening released what it could not. That was the whole of the design, tested at last all at once in the dark, and it was not a perfect design, and it did not pretend to be. Nature handed out no reward for a year of patient work. It searched every seam and every joint and every opening the hill had, and it found the one weakness no experiment could have found. The culvert, too small. And it found it the only way a thing like that ever gets found, in the storm, with a woman's back against the stone. Greyhaven came through the night not because Lenora had built it perfect, but because she had found and paid off nearly every mistake before the storm arrived to collect on them, and the one she had not found she cut a door for while it was drowning her. The rain stopped before dawn. The morning came up gray and clear on a valley that had been rearranged. Edwin Shaw was on the ground at first light with his rod and his book, because measuring was the only thing to do with a morning like that, and he measured both places and would not soften either. On the wheat bottom and the cleared pasture, 41 acres of planted ground stripped or buried, 3 to 5 inches of topsoil gone off the straight furrowed stretches. The main trench widened to 7 feet in places where it had been 2. The road cut near 4 feet deep at the ford. The lower granary standing in a lake of deposited mud. Everett's reclaimed pasture split down the middle by a new raw channel that had not been there the day before. On the hill, the 22 feet of wall gone. The 2 vineyard rows. The road shoulder. The flooded lower passage. The shed, and against it, in the 3 receiving pockets and the empty terrace, 1 1/4 to 2 inches of fresh silt, laid down soft and kept. Soil caught and held, that would have gone to the creek off any other ground in the basin. The main wall faces stood within the plumb marks Lenora had set behind them a year before. The cisterns were full, the seed was dry. No one argued with the numbers. Nature had already made the argument, and Shaw had only written it down. Everett came up the hill last when the others had already been there an hour. He came on foot, leading his horse, and he carried his hat in his hand instead of on his head. and there was mud on him to the knee and above it. He did not speak for a while. He looked at the 22-foot gap and the empty terrace full of silt where the wall had come down into it, and at the west wall standing, and at the apron still running the last of the water clear onto the rock. He did not say he was sorry. A proud man ruined in one night does not have the sorry in him yet, and Lenora did not need it and would not have known what to do with it. He knelt at the mouth of the overrun culvert and looked at its original size, 3 feet by 2, and then he stood and asked the only question he had come up the hill to ask. Which drain took the hill water? It was not an apology. It was a better than one. It was a man who had spent his whole life asking who deserved the land beginning, at last, to ask instead how the water crossed it. Lenora showed him, but she did not start with the wall that it held, because a weakness should not be allowed to hide behind success. She started with the culvert that had failed. This one, she said, this one was too small. I knew the size was for an ordinary rain, and I ran out of time before I made it bigger. And last night it backed up into the passage and near drowned me, and I cut the road open myself to save the rest of it. Then she walked him up. The upper interceptor that had carried the seep clear, the 2 spillways that had split the dangerous water, the empty terrace that had taken the flood's load, and the failed wall both. The rock apron where the storm had spent itself on ground it could not carry off. She named the failure first and the successes after, in that order, and Everett listened to all of it with his hat in his hands. Before she trusted anything that had held, she made a list of what had not, and she made it out loud so it could not sink out of sight under the relief of surviving. The culvert too small. The emergency release too rough, cut in a panic and needing to be cut clean. The road shoulder unsupported where it had washed. 1 terrace lip set an inch too high. The library clean-out too hard to reach in the dark when it mattered most. The debris screen thrown too close to its outlet. 6 weaknesses, named while the mud was still wet, because a weakness allowed to hide behind a success will wait, patient as water, for the next storm. She was still cutting the emergency release clean and rebuilding the culvert wider when the second rain came, 4 days later, a smaller one, but real. This time the upper cleanouts were open and stayed open. The new relief arch she had cut took its share of the flow. The widened culvert, 5 feet now where it had been 3, with a second smaller opening beside it, carried the water without backing an inch into the passage. The road edge she had rebuilt settled a little and held. No water reached the vault door. It was a small storm, and it proved a small thing, but the small thing it proved was the one that mattered, that the survival of the first night had not been luck. It had been the finding of the weakness and the naming of it and the paying for it, and the discipline held on the second asking the way it had on the first. The rebuilding took the rest of the autumn, and it was in the rebuilding, not in any words, that the family came back together. Nathaniel came up before sunrise one morning wearing work gloves, which was its own kind of statement from a man who had lowered his head at the will table and said nothing. He asked Inez, who kept the standard now the way her husband had kept it, how a stone went in. "Which face turns uphill?" Nathaniel said. She showed him. He set the stone and it rocked under his hand. The natural bed turned the wrong way. He turned it and set it again, and it rocked the other way. The third time he found the bed, laid the heavy face down into it, and pressed his palm to the top of it, and it did not move. The whole weight of it settled and still under his hand. Inez looked at it and nodded once, which from Inez was a great deal. Everett came with a wagon of stone he had pulled out of the flood. Good field stone the water had carried down off a broken fence line and left in the creek, salvaged and hauled up the switchback and stacked beside the damaged spillway without a word about where it had come from or why he'd brought it. Lower that lip another 2 inches, Lenora told him, at the spillway, the way she'd have told any hand. Everett lowered it 2 inches. He did not argue the 2 inches or ask why, which for Everett was the closest thing to an apology he owned, and he said, kneeling at the reset lip, that next year he'd run his furrows across the slope and not down it, which was the other closest thing. He replanted willow cuttings up the stripped slope where the belt had been cleared. He began in stages to fill the straight trench that had become a knife, and to divide the water it had gathered among several shallow courses that would spread its weight instead of aiming it. He stopped calling wet ground wasted ground, and when the work of a day was done, they sat beside the rebuilt wall with cups in their hands, Lenora and Inez, Everett and Nathaniel, Shaw when he was up, Phoebe when she came. And no one at any of those sittings ever once mentioned the day the land had been divided, or the key slid across the solicitor's table, or the spring struck from a widow's deed. It was behind them, and it stayed behind them, and the not mentioning of it was the whole of the forgiveness that any of them would ever put into words. Then the note came due, and the story asked its last question. Everett's mortgage on Willow Bend, $2,700 taken in better years, came due in February, and the flood had taken the ground it was borrowed against. His cattle reduced, his pasture split by a raw channel, his barns damaged, the road to his land cut, and the valuation that had backed the loan gone with the topsoil. He could not refinance on ruined ground. Merritt Co., who held that note too, expected a default and a forced sale, and told Lenora so plainly because Merritt told everyone the numbers plainly, and the reversal sat there in front of her, whole and available. Lenora had a debt-free manor. She had dry seed and a working cellar and marketable wine and silver she had never sold, an approving harvest behind her and credit enough now to stand in a forced sale and bid. Merritt told her, because he was honest to a fault about figures, that Willow Bend could likely be had for something near $1,650 if Everett defaulted. The 1,100-acre ranch, the barns, the upper spring. The rich bottomland and the spring struck from her deed, the good ground the whole wrong had turned on, was sitting there for a fraction of its worth, and she had the means to take it, and the man who had handed her the worst of the estate with a key across a table would have to watch her do it. She did not bid. She did the other thing, the smaller and the harder thing, and Inez did the arithmetic of it aloud at the kitchen table so that no one, least of all Lenora, could pretend it cost nothing. 18 bushels of wheat seed to Everett, out of the cellar, 6 barrels of barley feed, 3 wagon loads of stone off the bluff, 10 household workdays of her own and Inez's labor, willow cuttings out of Greyhaven's replanted belt, Shaw's contour measurements handed over, and the run of Ambrose's drainage records, which were the true inheritance, given to the brother who had taken the spring. Inez totaled it. $286 before a single day's labor was counted, and the labor on top. And to pay it, she drew her pen through the same short list that had been crossed and uncrossed all year. The parlor stove, gone for good now. The glazing for the west wing windows, gone. 2 weeks of hired pruning she would now do by hand. New harness leather Penny needed and would have to wait for. Inez read the crossed-off comforts out one by one and named the price, and did not complain of it then or after. No speech was made about any of it. Everett did not thank her in words, because words were not the currency between them anymore, and both of them knew it. What he did was this. The next morning, before the sun was up, he was already down on his own ruined slope, setting the first cross-slope drain below the split pasture with his own shovel, and he had left the last few feet of grade unset, and he was waiting there in the cold for Lenora to come down and check it before he closed it. She did not take Willow Bend. She did not ask for the spring. She stayed on the hill. The hill was enough. The work went off the bluff that autumn, out into the basin, carried by the people who had climbed up to laugh and stayed to learn. Phoebe Larkin put a diversion above her pear orchard, stone pockets around the young roots, and one controlled overflow onto exposed rock, and she kept her own measurements through the winter in a book of her own. Amos Drennan regraded a stock path to run across his slope instead of straight down it, and built low check walls in 2 gullies that had been cutting for years, and reduced his herd for good, and gave, at the store one evening, the precise admission that was worth more than any apology because it was exactly right. Those walls never tried to hold the whole storm. They only broke its strength. Nathaniel turned selected furrows across the grade, left the lowest flood-prone acres unplanted for a season to let them heal, and rebuilt Greyhaven's road before he mended his own porch. Everett filled his trench in stages and replanted his willow and divided his runoff and worked beside Lenora long after his own need for her seed and her stone had passed. Merritt Coe drew his line through the debt and brokered the wine without ever taking the cellar as security, and he kept 2 jars of soil on his store counter through the winter, the bluff and the bottom side by side, because they made his point better than he could. And Lenora showed anyone who climbed the hill and asked how to set a level, how to find the place where water wanted to leave, how to soak a stone overnight and wring it to know whether it would last, how to leave a door open behind a wall, how to measure a thing before extending it. She took money for the wine. She never took a cent for the principal, because the principal had been given to her the same way, up the same kind of hill, and a thing given like that is spoiled by selling it. The autumn settled in over ground that still showed every scar of the night that made it. Willow Bend would need years. The wheat bottom would need seasons of grass and rest before it grew wheat again. Greyhaven still had 26 rooms boarded and cold, and no stove in the parlor, and a west wing without glass. The bluff had not become rich. It never would. It was hard ground on a hard hill, and no amount of stone had turned it into the black-bottom soil the flood had carried off below. Rooks slept behind the first wall, the West Bank wall, the one Lenora had built wrong and taken apart stone by stone before any real storm ever came to test it. The ground behind it stayed cool. It always had. That was why the dog had chosen it on the first day, before there was a wall there at all, and it was why he chose it now. Phoebe came up one last time before the weather closed in, and stood beside Lenora at that wall, and asked the thing she had wondered all year and never asked. Did you ever think about giving up? Leaving it? Most mornings, Lenora said. That was all she said, and it was the truth, and it was enough. The hill never became richer than the valley below it. It never made a drop of water. All it ever did was hold what the sky gave long enough for the roots to use it, and let the rest go where it could do no harm. The drought had proved that rich soil could still die of thirst. The flood had proved that deep soil could vanish in a single night. Greyhaven endured for neither reason. It endured because every stone in it had been given a purpose, and every opening a place to send what it could not keep, and every mistake had been found and named and paid for by the one heir who took the worthless portion because she alone had knelt in the dust to see what it hid. Patience proved stronger than pride. Lenora bent at the rebuilt wall and lifted a stone off the grass. She turned it in her hands and read the grain of it, the way her father had taught her before she could read a book. She found the bed of it, turned it once, and set it into the gap in the wall, heavy face down, on its bed, the way a stone wants to lie. And behind it, through the open joint she had left for exactly this, a thin line of rainwater found the door before it could make one, and left the wall and ran off down the hill.